Today, my special guest is William Black. Now, William Black, he's, well, you probably heard quite a bit about him, especially in the days of Charles Keating. He made a name for himself, and he's the fellow who really took these guys to jail. Now, there's about 1,500 of them. We talked about this yesterday on our show. And folks, what are we hearing today? Listen to this. When we asked the president, how come nobody's going to jail? What's the deal? And his answer is
prosecutions on Wall Street. One of the biggest problems about the collapse of Lehman's and the subsequent financial crisis and the whole subprime lending fiasco is that a lot of that stuff wasn't necessarily illegal. It was just immoral or inappropriate or reckless.
now, wait a minute. Professor Black had a critical role during the S&L crisis in exposing congressional corruption. And during that period of time, a lot of corruption was exposed. A lot of people went to jail. Professor, what's going on here? Is this the truth, or is it, what's going on?
No, our saying, both as regulators and in criminology, is if you don't look, you don't find. And they've never looked. So how can the president know the actions were legal when they've never even been investigated?
Is that because Summers, Geithner, all these folks, Rubin, the same ones that I accuse of causing the problem, is on his team, and maybe that's not why he's looking?
That's part of it, certainly. But, I mean, we have to explain why none of this has occurred in two different administrations. Right?
Yeah, let's go through that, because let's go back to the past and during the Keating, and then let's go forward. And why don't you explain to us, what is the difference? Why? What's the difference here?
The difference is that for these kinds of cases, you have to understand there are no cops on the beat except the regulators. In other words, if you had called the Houston Police Department and said, I think something crazy is happening at Enron, and you should look into it, they would have, hung up the phone on you. They don't investigate those kinds of things. Only the regulators do, and the regulators have to serve as what we call the Sherpas.
Mm-hmm.
You're going up against the best criminal defense lawyers in the world, and they're willing to spend money like water. Often it's the corporation's money, after all. And in any event, the CEO is the target, so his overwhelming priority is to stay out of prison. So it's a tough task, and so the metaphor that it's like trying to get to the top of a Himalayan mountain makes sense. What do Sherpas do? Sherpas do two key functions. One, they do the heavy lifting, and in that context, that means we have the investigative resources and the expertise that the FBI cannot possibly have to actually find these frauds and to explain these frauds. And the second thing that a Sherpa does is serve as the trail guide. And so it's our criminal referrals that are the trail map. These would be 20 to 30 pages in length. They'd have 200 to 300 pages of attachments of all the key documents, and they would set out, this is how the fraud worked, this is how it came from the very top of the organization, here's why it isn't honest business, here's why it isn't just unethical, but likely to be criminal. And so our agency, the Office of Thrift Supervision, in the Savings and Loan Crisis, made well over 10,000 criminal referrals. This led to over 1,000 felony convictions in cases designated as major by the Justice Department. So this isn't all the convictions. This is the big ones, over 1,000. And even that understates the degree of prioritization, because we worked with the Justice Department to create the top 100 list. So this is the 100 dirtiest S&Ls. And that would have translated somewhere to 500 to 700 individuals. The overwhelming majority of those people were prosecuted. Despite being up against really good opponents, we got a 90% conviction rate. Flash forward to the current crisis. So by the time of the Bush administration, the criminal referral process had been terminated at the agencies. So the Office of Thrift Supervision in this crisis made 0 criminal referrals. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which regulates the largest national banks, depending on who you believe, made either 0 or 3 trivial criminal referrals. The Federal Reserve made 3 criminal referrals, 2 of them against foreign entities, and none of them involving the major frauds. We don't have numbers on the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, but we know that the number is very small as well, embarrassingly small. They don't want to tell us about the number. So the criminal referral process simply ended. The entire Sherpa process ended. And so the FBI made a brilliant call that people need to know about, and that is in September 2004, in open testimony in the House of Representatives, picked up by at least some major media, the FBI spokesperson said there is an epidemic of mortgage fraud, his words, and he predicted that it would cause an economic crisis if it were not stopped. Plenty of time to act and prevent the crisis. You see, that's what everyone misses. And you want to know how bad this is? Mm-hmm. So we have a Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, right? The inevitable national commission to look into the causes of this crisis. And that's a big deal, right? And they call Holder in, the Attorney General of the United States of America, to testify about what did the Justice Department and the FBI do. And as you doubtless know, and your listeners will know, before the Attorney General of the United States makes a major testimony like that, under oath and such, they get prepared by the top people in the agency. Say, be able to say, what did the FBI and the Justice Department do? Mm-hmm. So they ask him, what did you do in response to this FBI, and what did your agency do in response to this FBI warning in 2004? Now, Holder, of course, was not Attorney General back then. There was obviously a Republican Attorney General under President Bush. Right. But Holder told them he'd never heard that this had happened.
Oh, my God.
So this would be the first thing you would prepare an Attorney General on, right? Hey, we got it right. We got it right earlier than anybody in America, virtually. And we warned people. And these folks are so the Justice Department has simply become a farce for the last 11 years or so. And okay, you can certainly, as if you're Obama, you can blame this. I inherited a dysfunctional Attorney General and office, and I inherited banking regulatory agencies that have become a farce. But that would be one of your top priorities to fix. Yeah, and
right,
there has not only been no fix, it's been gone the other way. It's been made worse.
Is it that he's not fixing it because when you go back and you look at Larry Summers and you go back and you look at Greenspan and you look at Geithner under Clinton, it was clear under the when this one gal, her name was actually Brooksley Bourne. She was with a small agency, and she's the one that came forward and said to these guys, look, hey, these derivatives aren't going to work. And they put a gag order on her. They got her fired. So, and then they end up working for Obama, the same crew. And, of course, she was right, because she said at the time, look, if you go forward with these things, this is going to take down not only the United States, it'll take down the world. Of course, they put a gag order on her, and she got fired. She was with the Commodities Future Trading Commission, I think it is, CF.
CFTC.
Yeah, right. So it appears that the bad guys end up working for Obama, so there's really no incentive to really dig into this. And the fact that I go back and listen to Barney Frank, and first Barney Frank says, here, let me play a couple clips here. Here, listen to this, what he says first.
This is not the dot-com situation. We have problems with people having invested in business plans for which there was no reality, and people building fiber optic cable for which there was no need. Homes that are occupied may see an ebb and flow in the price at a certain percentage level, but you're not going to see the collapse that you see when people talk about a bubble. And so those of us on our committee in particular will continue to push for home ownership.
Then he says, after the collapse,
those of us on our committee in particular will continue to push for home ownership.
all right, I gave you the wrong cut, but we had, in other words, he first said that he was only for pushing apartments, that he was only involved with and said, look, we need more apartments. He said, I never pushed housing, and then we have a clip that says just the opposite. He was for housing. So it seems to me like Barney Frank and Dodd, and then you go back, who they were overseeing the Fannie and Freddie. It seems like that's where the real problem started with Reigns. Am I right? I mean, how did Reigns get off the hook here?
All right, so we have a whole bunch of things that you've asked me.
Right. I could keep you on all day because it just seems like it's so amazing nothing's happening, but go ahead.
Okay, so let me start with the CFTC aspect.
There you go.
And Brooksley Born.
Okay.
Brooksley Born is, in fact, a national hero that people should know about. She was chair of the CFTC, which is supposed to regulate derivatives. And she rightly said credit default swaps are growing massively. We have no effective regulation, and they're very dangerous. So she proposed a rule for comment. And the financial world went crazy and made an effort to destroy this entire proposed rule. And they successfully enlisted, as you said, within the administration, the person who was by then the leading economic advisor of Clinton, who was Larry Summers. And they enlisted, Alan Greenspan, who was the head of the Federal Reserve. Politically, he's a Republican. They enlisted Phil Gramm, who was the powerful and very anti-regulatory chief Republican in the Senate on financial issues. And they even enlisted the head of the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, who was something of a reformer. And so all of these people went and sought to destroy Brooksley Born's rule. They didn't actually get her fired, but they did get one of the most outrageous laws in history passed, and that is the Commodities Future Modernization Act of 2000, with the strong support of both parties, but this in particular happened in the Clinton administration. And that law didn't simply say you can't go forward with this particular rule. It said the CFTC is hereby all statutory authority to regulate these kinds of derivatives is hereby removed. And indeed, the law is so outrageous that it also exempted credit default swaps from any prosecution under state laws for fraud.
Jeez.
Right? Boiler room laws. All right? That's how crazed this law was. And as I said, it had broad support, went through very quickly, and it is what blew up AIG. And when AIG blew up, that had the potential for blowing up a very large chunk of the financial world. So it's one of the most irresponsible actions. Also, it tells us how the lack of seriousness in the response to this crisis, because we should have passed a one-sentence law that says the Commodities Future Modernization Act of 2000 is hereby repealed, instead of a whole bunch of convoluted provisions that go on for literally many hundreds of pages about all of that. And by the way, your listeners can go and see. There's an excellent Frontline documentary on this.
Mm-hmm.
It's called The Warning. It's about Brooksley Born. And here's one of the absolute key takeaways. Alan Greenspan was personally used by Charles Keating, hired to go to the U.S. Senate and help recruit with Keating the senators who became known as the Keating Five, who intervened with us. I'm the person who took the notes of that meeting and tried to get us not to take enforcement action against the largest violation of our rules in history by Charles Keating Lincoln Savings. He then wrote an infamous letter that said we shouldn't regulate these particular things called direct investments that were destroying Lincoln Savings because Lincoln Savings posed, quote, no foreseeable risk of loss, unquote, to the insurance fund. It was only the most expensive failure. And it was after those disasters that he was made chairman of the Federal Reserve. And so he's the leading opponent of regulation throughout this process. If you had to pick one individual, it'd be Alan Greenspan, because most of this stuff, so most of the liar's loans that drove this crisis were, it was the lenders overwhelmingly who put the lie in the liar's loans. And second, it was primarily done out of entities that were not federally regulated. So these are the mortgage banks, and these are affiliates of Citi and such that are not insured institutions. But in 1994, so a long time ago, Congress passed something called OEPA, which is the Home Ownership Equity Protection Act of 1994, that uniquely gave the Fed the ability to do safety and soundness regulation for any mortgage lender. And Greenspan had fellow members of the Fed who begged him to use this power, who said, look what's happening in non-prime loans. It's a disaster. We have to act. And Alan Greenspan refused to use that authority. And then Bernanke, his successor, refused to use that authority. And they finally used that authority only under congressional pressure, which, by the way, included folks like Dodd and Frank. They finally used that authority, but not till August 2008, and that was just a little late in terms of non-prime loans. They had virtually ceased for over a year before the Fed finally acted. Now, let me go back and answer your question about Fannie and Freddie and the politicians. I was an expert witness for what was then called OFEO, which was the federal regulator for Fannie and Freddie, in their enforcement action suing Frank Rain and the chief financial officer as well at Fannie Mae. And so I have nothing good to say about Fannie and Freddie or Dodd or Frank, except I would say this. People don't understand how bad they were, Fannie and Freddie. Fannie and Freddie were fraudulent entities, and they were fraudulent entities well before this crisis. And this is not simply my opinion as an expert looking at it, and as a former regulator and a white-collar criminologist, where my area of expertise is these things, but it was also the opinion of the Securities and Exchange Commission staff, which explicitly charged Fannie Mae with using fraudulent accounting for the purpose of maximizing their bonuses of the senior officers, right? We call this in criminology an accounting control fraud, where the people who control the organization that seems to be legitimate use accounting as their weapon of choice to defraud others. The accounting creates the record fictional income that pays them record bonuses, and then they all walk away from this. So nobody in either party was willing to do anything serious about stopping Fannie and Freddie from doing non-prime loans. There was legislation introduced that some of your listeners may know about in, I think, 2003. If not, it was 2004. But that was designed to deal with a completely different issue, and that was interest rate risk. But nobody in either party was warning about Fannie and Freddie buying stuff that was non-prime. And here's the primary reason they weren't. Fannie and Freddie were not leaders in this originally. In fact, they lost enormous market share because it was the Lehmans, the Merrill Lynches, and all those folks who bought originally the great bulk of the liar's loans and the subprime loans. Fannie and Freddie did some, but instead of the people who think, they were eager to do it or they were pushed by the politicians, Fannie and Freddie typically hid the fact that they were doing the non-prime lending, called it prime in their reports, sought to minimize it repeatedly. So this doesn't come from the politicians. It comes from the fact that Fannie and Freddie were privatized, and they acted just like Lehman, just like Merrill Lynch, just like Bear Stearns and such. All of those entities not subject to any federal requirement to make loans to poorer people, but all of them accounting control frauds. So, as I say, Fannie and Freddie, they're worse than people think. They were frauds, and they were frauds from a very early point. The irony is, once they are stopped from their original fraud by the actions of the Securities and Exchange Commission, first, the Justice Department fails to prosecute. Right? So, as I say, you've got an SEC complaint that says the senior officers, the controlling officers of Fannie Mae, deliberately used false accounting for the purpose of maximizing their bonuses, which is a felony. And the SEC takes this action in 2003 to 2006. The Justice Department refuses to prosecute either Fannie or Freddie.
Wow.
All right, so that's the big thing. The second big thing is that by 2006, the top regulator for Fannie and Freddie, because the SEC has found these frauds and ordered them to restate their financial statements, the federal regulators actually have complete leverage over the place, and they can order them to do or not do whatever they want. And it's at this juncture that Fannie and Freddie go absolutely crazy into buying all kinds of non-prime loans, in particular liar's loans, which don't qualify, by the way, for any of their affordable housing. So they're not buying it because of affordable housing. They're buying it because it maximizes their bonuses. And what's happened is OFEO, again, the federal regulators, have quite appropriately limited their growth of their portfolio. So their only way to get high, current, albeit fictional, earnings is to buy the worst crap out there, which is the liar's loans. And so that's why they pile onto it heavily. And again, they hide the amount that they're doing. And the terrible irony is, I met, personally at length with the head of this agency and his deputy, who, by the way, is still in charge as an acting of the successor agency, which is called FHFA. They simply never viewed it as legitimate to regulate. They're not evil people. They were in no way intimidated by politicians and such. The head of the agency was one of George Bush's closest friends, all the way back from prep school.
Jeez.
Had, again, complete leverage and simply wouldn't use it because they just didn't think it was legitimate to regulate entities unless and until they knew it was a disaster. And that kind of mindset was devastating. So, yes, Fannie and Freddie, are they a huge part of the problem? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Why? because they had the same perverse incentives from their executive compensation as Lehman Brothers and everybody else. And we have a really good test of why they did what they did, because no one made them buy liar's loans.
And,
They bought liar's loans because it inflated income and their bonuses.